All right, so I just wanted to give you a quick update on kind of what's been happening with the sea otters in Washington State. As folks have heard already this morning, they were pretty much eliminated from our coastline by the early 1900s. We suspect that the last one in Washington was killed in the Ocean Shores area around about the time that the act that prevented them from being killed was passed. But there were some incidental sightings reported in the mid-1950s along the outer coast of Washington. They were never ever confirmed though they were actually sea otters. They could have very well have been river otters. We just don't really know if there were any otters left along the coastline. We suspect not, however. So otters were reintroduced in 1969 and 70 from Amchitka. There were 29 otters that were released in the Point Grenville area in 1969, right down in here. They were pretty much just dumped out in the water and said, figure it out, you're on your own. Within 2 weeks, almost half of them had already died. So another 30 otters were captured and released in 1970. They were released in a little more nice way by putting them in pens and letting them acclimate up in the La Push area, which is a more rocky habitat area, much more friendly to where they had come from, and so they seem to do a little bit better. However, we still think that a significant portion of them died, and the population that we have now may be from as few as 10 otters. But in any case, they've done pretty well for themselves. They currently occupy about an 80-mile stretch of the coastline along the outer side of the Olympic Peninsula between Cape Flattery and Point Grenville down in here. That's where the primary portion of the population is. There's also some that move seasonally into the Straits of Juan de Fuca. We also have been getting reports of otters. Right now we have a single male otter that's been living in South Puget Sound near Olympia for at least the last 3 years, all by his little lonesome. We've had a number of other ones that have been reported around the San Juan Islands and into the Straits on a relatively consistent basis, but it's not any large numbers by any stretch. We also have had reports of otters as far south in Oregon as Cape Arago. Those reports started in about 2008, and we've had just intermediate reports since then. The population has done pretty well for itself, although not as well as others have done. The population wasn't monitored very consistently since they were introduced in 1970 until about 1989, when a consistent method of survey was implemented by then USGS and Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife, and we've carried those surveys on since 1989. The population has been growing at about 9.5% per year, with our latest count in 2017 of just over 2,000 animals. We weren't able to do a count in 2018, but I suspect that the trajectory would be very similar, keep going up. This just gives you an idea from 1977 through 2014, kind of how the expansion of the sea otters occurred along the outer coast. If you watch by 2014, you can kind of see that they primarily occupied north of the La Push area where they were introduced. And then there's this one really big hot spot right down in here that is our destruction island, and I'll get into that in a little bit. So our coastline is a little bit variable and has different habitat types, and we divide our coastline kind of about halfway. Our 80-mile stretch about halfway is La Push, and we look at what's the population been doing north of La Push, because that's a bit more rocky habitat. The otters tend to be more near shore. They also tend to be in smaller rafts or smaller groups of rafts. Although we do get rafts of over 200 in this area, the population accounts for about 20% of the whole population as a total. And I just want to give you an idea of kind of the habitat that they occupy here. It's very rocky habitat with a lot of offshore islands. Islands that are 2 to 3 miles offshore with a lot of pinnacles and rocks that ameliorate a lot of the big storms. It also gives the otters a lot of places to move and vary when you have a storm coming from the south or coming from the north. They have places that they can go and kind of hide out. In this area we have a lot of kelp cover that they like to be in, and you can see this from the surface, but a lot of times you can't see the kelp from the surface, but it is underwater. It's still in these rocky habitat type areas. Distinguish this from our southern portion south of La Push. Part of that area is also rocky habitat, but as we go farther south, it becomes very sandy habitat. The otters here have to be offshore, more offshore. They're not as near shore as they are in the northern area. We see really large rafts. We've had rafts of over 700 animals that are offshore, about 2 miles offshore. I'm going to have a picture of that, and I think Sean has a video to show you of one of those rafts that we've seen fairly consistently over the last 4 or 5 years offshore. This portion of the population now is about 80% of the total population, but it is not consistently spread throughout this whole range. Out of all of these otters, 80% of these otters are within 5 rafts in this area, one of which accounts for almost half of the population in the southern area. And it's offshore, a group of 700. So they're not consistently spread within this area. I'll just give you an idea of kind of what they have to deal with here. Because once we get south of the Hoh River along our coastline, it becomes much more generic type habitat, very straight and sandy, without many offshore islands or kelp beds in which they can kind of find safety. This is a picture of our large group of 694 otters. The interesting thing here for us is that generally when we see our large rafts, we usually think of the rafts of either being a female group or a male group. This one defies that. This is a combination group. We didn't think about that until we started to zoom in and count the otters in this, because this is part of our survey effort. There are pups in this group. The males tend to be in the center, and then the females with pups are around the outer edges. So that came as a kind of a bit of a surprise to us. So they're hanging out in open water, with the one exception being our Destruction Island area, which is an island 3 miles offshore of the Clay Lock area, for those that are familiar with the Washington coastline. We've always had a group of otters down here, primarily a male group, that hung out over in this eastern side, and there's a kelp bed here, and they would float south or north of the island in open water. They do have the ability in storms, however, to move over into this cove and hang out. In about the mid-90s, we saw a group of females move down here, and they tend to hang out in this reef over in here, and that's pretty much where they tend to stay. I'll give you an idea of where the males can go. They like to hide out in this little cove here. They also, when the weather is just right, they like to haul out. And we do see a lot of hauling out behavior on our Washington coastline, so the rocks seem to be a pretty important role for them. That gives you kind of an idea of kind of the habitat that they are inhabiting in the Washington coastline area. As you would expect, and what Ann talked about earlier, is their diet is quite diverse depending upon where they are. If they're in an area that they've occupied for longer, in north of the Little Push area in particular, their diet is pretty diverse. They picked off the easy things like the urchins early on and have kind of taken care of that, and so now they have a much more diverse diet. However, that is very dependent upon where they're at within the range. So if you move down into their sandy habitat, the diversity is not available for them, so they're having to eat what they have available. And down in that area in particular, it's Dungeness crab and razor clams, which you may anticipate being a bit of a problem. So one of the other things I just wanted to talk about is some of the things that we've identified as causes of mortality in this population. In 2001 and 2002, we had a lot of otters washing up on shore in the southern portion of their range, actually south of Point Grenville in the Ocean Shores area. And we went, oh, what's going on here? That's not an area where we have a lot of otters, and they're washing up on shore, so what is going on with that? Since then, we've established a stranding program. We have a 1-800 number that people can report otters on shore to us. We also have coverage in Oregon through the NOAA Marine Mammal Stranding Network, and Jim is here. Where'd you go, Jim? He's back there. He is based here in Newport. He reports marine mammals on shore go to him. In your northern Oregon, they go to Deb Duffield at Portland State University. If it's a sea otter, they give me a call, and we kind of handle it and figure out what's going on. But our program is very much dependent upon volunteers and all of the people who are on the outer coast to help us respond to these animals, because I live in Olympia, so I'm at least about 2 hours away from anywhere there's an animal coming on shore for the most part. But in any case, we get about 26 reports per year in Washington. We've been collecting these since 2002. Our highest stranding year was in 2016, where we had 48 reports. Last year, in 2017, we had 41 reports. Overall, I've had more than 400 reports of sea otter strandings along our coastline since I began the program. And 12 of those have come from Oregon. And we saw our first stranding report was in 2010 on the Oregon coast. Since then, we've had 12 total reports in Oregon of stranded otters. Because of this program, we've been able to collect fresh dead animals and in some cases live animals that we had to euthanize and be able to do full necropsies on them and determine our causes of mortality. And our leading source of mortality is infectious disease. And in particular, it's Sarcocystis neurona, which is a parasite that's only definitive known host is the Virginia opossum. So it's a bit of a conundrum for us of how the oocysts from this parasite are making it into the food source for the sea otters. We're still trying to figure that out, but it accounted for more than 50% of the otters that we examined as a source of mortality for them. We've also seen a variety of bacterial and viral infections. The leptospirosis is what started off our stranding program. Remember I said we had these diseases in 2001 and 2002, all these mortalities. Turns out it was leptospirosis, which was the cause of death. We've not seen it in our otters since then, even though there have been outbreaks in the pinnipeds that co-occur along the coast with them. So we don't really know what the source of that was and why it went through the population in the way it did. So we're just kind of holding our breath that it doesn't happen again. We've had 6 confirmed cases of canine distemper virus as a source of mortality in our otters, from as far south as the Quinault Indian Nation to the northern portion up at Cape Flattery. So they were spread throughout the coast. We do not know what the source of the canine distemper was. So that is something that we also are on the lookout for, although we haven't seen another case of this since 2008. So it is something that our population would be naive to at this point in time. Draw your attention to a variety of other sources of mortality. To a couple of these things. Our drowning cases are all results from gillnet mortalities. So if you have fisheries that are along the outer coast that are allowed to use gill nets, there is that potential for entanglement. We've also seen a number of severe head trauma cases. In a lot of cases, those were as a result of paralytic shellfish poisoning or domoic acid poisoning that likely inhibited their behavior to escape, and they were hit by boats. That's our large assumption, let me put it that way. And our 2 shark attacks that we've had have both been otters that were here that stranded in Newport. So our shark attacks have all been along the coasts of Oregon. The 2 gunshot wounds were cases in Washington and the Claylock area. We presume because of interactions with fishermen. Our most recent case, which may interest Lillian, is a microcystin poisoning that just was reported to us last week as a cause of death in 2017 of an otter. So we're just now going to have to be starting off on that. This is a poison that is produced by blue-green algae in freshwater habitats that somehow makes itself way out into the marine environment. So we're going to have to be doing a bit of a research to figure out where that came from. But in any case, you can see there's a whole variety of different mortality causes for this population, but they're still increasing. So it's really not preventing them from expanding their range, and it's not preventing them from increasing in numbers. But it's still something that we need to monitor because some of these are human caused and things that may be a source of mortality for otters here in Oregon. So just give you kind of a rundown on what the statuses are for the Washington and Oregon population. They are not listed under the Endangered Species Act. Lillian kind of talked already about the Marine Mammal Protection Act. Because our population is doing so well, it's not considered depleted or strategic. We have also developed an oil spill response plan for our Washington population with our co-managers, the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife. It's a fairly well-developed oil spill response plan. It is something that you would want to do here in Oregon as well. The one thing I would say is it's not at all funded. So we don't have any of the equipment or any of the people in place to actually implement the plan. While we have a plan, if we were to have an incident, we wouldn't be able to necessarily implement it very well. So these are all other things you need to kind of take into consideration as you start having a population and being able to handle an emergency situation. The other thing we also had to develop in Washington was a nuisance otter plan. This is our bad otter. Her name was Dumas. She made her way into Puget Sound. She had no really other friends, so humans became her friends, and so we made a decision to relocate her back to the outer coast. So we ended up making a nuisance plan in case this should ever happen again, with all of the co-managers, federal and state and tribal co-managers, so that if we had this again, we would have a plan on how to deal with them. It's something that you'll want to consider depending on where otters go in Oregon. They are listed as endangered by the state of Washington. They developed a recovery plan in 2004. It was based upon a carrying capacity that was developed by Kristen Lydra. It had two criteria. It had a numbers, and then it also had a distribution. Those were the recovery criteria that the otters needed to meet in order to be reclassified from endangered to threatened. They met at least one of those criteria, and they reclassified the otter in Washington to threatened in August, based upon the fact that of the steady numbers, increase in numbers, and some genetic evidence that there was exchange with British Columbia. They have their new criteria that they will implement if they go to recover it down to sensitive would be an average population of 2,187 otters based upon the carrying capacity that was developed by Kristen, and then they have to have some plans in place. Whether we can get there, we'll see. We're pretty close to those numbers. I would say over the next 3 or 4 years, we will be pretty close to that 3-year average population, but we have not made our distribution. Right now they are in still a pretty limited range within the Washington coast. It's about 80 miles, as I said before, which makes them pretty susceptible to oil spills. We know that there has been a lot of increased activity for bringing oil out of the Columbia River, potentially out of the Grays Harbor area, and we know for a fact it's going to be coming out of the Straits of Juan de Fuca, maybe much higher likelihoods from British Columbia in particular. So that makes them much more susceptible to oil spills. So that is a pretty big conservation concern for us, as well as them being all compacted into one area. When 80% of the population occurs within a 40-mile stretch, any kind of disease or poisoning that goes through that can go through the population pretty quickly. So there's something that we want to take into consideration when they're confined to a limited space. And then also, the genetic diversity, I think, is going to be a key, and Sean's going to talk a lot about that when she gets up and talks. The one thing I did want to mention about the genetics is why I have combined Oregon with the Washington in this talk is that the otters that have been identified along the Oregon coast have been identified as coming from the Washington population. So we did genetic work on that to show that they are moving south from Washington, not up from California. The other threat or kind of conservation issues and things that I think we really need to take into consideration is the human interactions for a variety of reasons that were pointed out this morning. Where the otters currently occur is a pretty protected area. All of this area here from Cape Flattery and all what these yellow dots represent is all the Olympic Coast National Marine Sanctuary. So that's an area that has a lot of protections. The lands, the islands are all managed by the National Wildlife Refuge System, and then most of the just near shore environment is managed by the Olympic National Park or the Quinault, Macaw, or Quileute, or Hoh tribes. So there's a lot of protection along those coastlines where they currently occur now. However, even within these areas, they are susceptible to entanglement in fisheries. Like I said earlier, we've had 2 gillnet mortalities, but where they are occurring is also heavily fished for Dungeness crab, and we know from the types of gear that they use in Washington that they can get entrapped in those types of pots. There's been some changes in California to help reduce those entrapment issues, but that has not happened in Washington. And then there's also conflicts over valuable resources. Dungeness crab is a really, really important fishery along the outer coast of Washington. And as the otters are moving south, they're moving into razor clam, which is also a highly valuable resource. And then, of course, as the otters, if they move south or they move into Puget Sound, they're moving into areas where there is more potential for just interaction with humans, in particular into the Puget Sound area. And then we also have gooey duck harvest areas that are going to be really important fisheries there should the otters move into those areas. There can be potential for conflicts there. So these are all types of things that as you pursue moving otters into Oregon, things that you're going to want to take into consideration. Just to sum up what's going on with the population is it is increasing at a steady rate, but it occupies a pretty limited range, and I think that it's going to prevent them from being able to tolerate a catastrophic event. So as you put otters or consider having otters here in Oregon, you want to take that into consideration as the distribution along the coastline so that they are able to overcome some catastrophic events. Also, we're going to need to take a look at the sources of mortality that may come from both the ocean side and shark-related attacks or oil spills, but also from the land-based side. In our case, was the Sarcocystis neurona. So I'd say monitoring is pretty darn crucial for these anything that you do here. We find it's really crucial. I know these guys are all going to say a very similar thing: is monitoring is really crucial, and funding is not easy to come by. So that is something to definitely take into consideration. Lastly, I just want to acknowledge the village of people that it takes to monitor this pretty small population of otters. We do an annual census, and Sean here helps us with that, as well as a variety of other people. And then our mortality investigations is also takes a huge number of people to help us keep track of all of that. I think we're taking questions later, so I'll skip on that.